Okay, thanks everyone for coming. This is, I think, the very last National Security Speakers Series talks because we don't have any money in the budget anymore. Anyway, it was a great series while it lasted, if I must say so myself. Okay, so today I'm really pleased that we have Jennifer Erickson here. She is an associate professor from Boston College. She is going to be speaking on reputation, public opinion, and U.S. nuclear non-use in the Cold War. Her first book, well, her only book right now, yeah, but that's okay. Dangerous Trade, Arms Imports, Human Rights, and International Reputation was published on Columbia University Press in 2015. It won the APSA Foreign Policy Section Best Book Award. She got her PhD from Cornell University. She is now that Alex is retired, she is my favorite associate editor at Security Studies. Yeah, she does, like, the associate editors do all the work. I get the credit, but they do all the work, and she is the best. But I keep giving her ethnic conflict manuscripts anyway. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to her talk, and I won't take up any more time. So go ahead.
So I understand this is like the last week of the semester, and you've actually all shown up, so I'm really grateful. I've met so many nice people who've come through OSU, and met so many nice people during my visit that I've been so happy to be here, and it's really kind of you to come. This is a first cut at a new project that's interested in the mechanisms of nuclear non-use in the absence of formal international laws and regulations about the use of nuclear weapons in war. And in particular, I have to be honest, it comes out of a frustration for sort of working and trying to understand the nuclear taboo literature and sort of broadly the nuclear non-use literature as a whole. There's a lot of ink that's been spilled, especially in recent years, about the nuclear taboo. Is it a taboo? Is it strengthening? Is it weakening? Lots of interesting survey experiments that are out there. And I think kind of thinking about the taboo in relation to deterrence and tradition and these other sort of big theory explanations out there together can be difficult because all of them require some kind of sense of the internal motivations of U.S. policymakers in their decision making in order to resolve it. So to some level, they might be kind of unresolvable by kind of our ideas about social science. So in practice, they might be difficult to resolve, and in practice, they might not all be that mutually exclusive either. They may not be alternative explanations always for one another. And so that means these kind of endless debates about which one does the best job might not be, and from my view, the most productive debates that we could be having. And instead, I want to sort of spend a little bit more time thinking about the mechanisms of nuclear non-use, both theoretically and empirically, so we can get a little bit more traction about what's going on here. So rather than trying to resolve these big theory differences in the nuclear non-use literature, this paper that this talk is based on makes two moves. One is to develop the reputational mechanism that comes into almost all of the sort of arguments, big theory arguments that are out there. I want to develop reputation as a mechanism both theoretically and empirically. And so I'm trying to do that in this paper as one mechanism for non-use behind these theories. So picking up on other work that I've done on reputation in IR, and Randy mentioned my book, my only book. I therefore look at global public opinion and international reputational concerns as a part of the decision-making process and one potential indirect source of pressure on U.S. policymakers, non-use of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And in doing that, I'm also going to make the argument, the second move that the paper makes, is that some of these arguments and empirical evidence that the taboo literature relies on related to public opinion and reputational pressures are, in fact, potentially separate, and that should be sort of peeled away and thought of separately from the taboo literature. So I think there's a sort of eclectic group of people at Ohio State, and so I want to say for various people who might be in the room, to the national security folks who are really interested in sort of hard national security issues, I'm sorry I'm going to talk about norms. I hope that's okay with you. For the people who are really interested in taboos and social taboos, I'm going to pick away at the nuclear taboo a little bit. I'm also sorry about that. And then finally, for the public opinion people who are really interested in public opinion, we're hoping maybe there would be like some amazing survey experiment from the Cold War that I've unearthed and been able to show you. I'm sorry. This is going to be sort of standard kind of archival research, but one that sort of engages with ideas about what public opinion was at the time. So all of this is a spin-off from my broader new book project. So when I have a second book, I plan to call it Norms at War. You know, you have to get your department to give you a little space from teaching and service to do some of these things, so it might be a while. But Norms at War, that investigates the origins of international laws and norms about war and sort of new weapons technologies, and in particular, how states manipulate and seek to manipulate the laws and norms of war, particularly as it relates to new weapons technologies and how they try to introduce new weapons technologies to wartime conflict, what consequences those manipulative efforts might have, and especially unintended consequences, and why they might engage in it. And more specifically, it's interested in questions about why are some new weapons technologies accepted and seen as legitimate and others banned. Why is it acceptable to kill some people in some ways but not in other ways? And oftentimes, answers to those questions don't really correlate as closely to ideas about military utility, military effectiveness, or humanitarian effects as they are often assumed to be. And often we have studies of weapons bans without sort of looking at weapons that have similar qualities but might be legitimated sort of at the same time. So it's a broader comparative study. And in doing this, I'm interested in how states manipulate the laws and norms of war to be able to use those weapons. So empirically, there's a World War I component of this project that looks at poison gas in submarines, potentially also airplanes and tanks. There's a World War II component that looks at the development of nuclear non-use norms after World War II, and then hopefully eventually someday there'll be contemporary cases looking at lethal autonomous weapon systems and cyber technology. One of the many interesting things that comes out of this project on the nuclear weapons case is a gap between what international law says you can and cannot do and kind of what norms say you can and cannot do, sort of setting a higher standard with norms. And in order to understand that gap, I started to delve into the non-use literature and tried to understand non-use norms and the mechanisms behind that, which brings me to this project. All right. So fairly early on in the nuclear era, U.S. policymakers start to engage in what Nina Tannenwald calls taboo talk. That is referencing a taboo, moral inhibitions, normative inhibitions against nuclear weapons in their discussions. And we get quotes like this from Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in 1953, that says, somehow or another, we must manage to remove the taboo from the use of these weapons. And we can thank Dulles for giving us this taboo language that has sort of stuck around since then. But I will argue this is by no means evidence that a taboo exists or that it restrains decision-making. Indeed, taboo at the time, so if you go back and you look at anthropological literature from the time and earlier, was not meant as a positive quality. It's seen as a product of uncivilized and often non-Western civilizations and something you want to be rid of, something that you should overcome in your attempt to be civilized. So it's likely meant here in a derisive way. Dulles isn't giving us a term that he's thought through social scientifically and applied carefully to this problem. And so we see this sort of problem. The use of taboo isn't really the same thing. And they're starting to talk about taboos far earlier than we might expect anybody to have developed and sort of internalized nuclear weapons norms, much less a taboo which is meant to be stronger than a regular norm. So in reality, I think there are reasons to question whether those normative considerations rise to the level of a taboo, whether that taboo might have sort of a direct source of influence on state behavior, and how taboos are in fact even identified and defined. And because we can't assess policymakers' own moral preferences and beliefs as a part of their decision-making or their weight on decision-making, I think it's useful to examine some external and more observable considerations that might weigh on their decision-making and mechanisms for promoting restraint that are associated with taboos and other of the non-use literature. So with this in mind, I asked in this paper about the role of international public opinion or global public opinion and what that might play as a mechanism of nuclear non-use. And it's a mechanism that comes up, or it's an idea that gets put on the table both by the tradition and the taboo literatures as a source of potential restraint for U.S. policymakers. And I will argue that those literatures leave this sort of theoretically and empirically underdeveloped. And so what I try to do in this paper is develop the reputational mechanism and the role of international public opinion. In doing so, I'm going to argue that you should peel off that reputational argument as a distinct sort of pressure. One, because it might not really fit with what a taboo says that it is, and two, because sometimes those normative constraints or those kind of reputational concerns might not be related as much to nuclear weapons as some other kind of norm that's out there in the international system. And so in doing this, I'm thinking about policymakers as engaged in strategic calculations that are thinking about kind of the political and social environment that they're in, and the costs and merits of nuclear use at dire moments in U.S. National security history, whatever their sort of personal beliefs are. So note that this approach considers international public opinion as an external pressure that's distinct from policymakers' own personal normative beliefs, but it also isn't meant to exclude those other pressures. I'm not saying that those personal beliefs don't matter. I'm saying I'm not measuring them and trying to measure them in this project. So to preview, I argue that strategic officials are concerned about the social reputational consequences of nuclear use as part of their nuclear decision-making process. I'm not claiming that it's the whole of it. I'm not claiming that deterrence doesn't matter. I'm not claiming that personal morality doesn't play a role. I'm just saying this is one component that we should be talking about here. And in this way, nuclear non-use can be a strategic response to perceptions of normative constraints or norms that are sort of out there that U.S. policymakers believe are held elsewhere in the world, but not necessarily ones that they themselves have bought into. They may have, they may not have, we don't know. So as a result, I think we should treat this reputation talk, I'll argue, as separate from taboo talk. And I think these distinctions matter for a number of reasons. One is that this might, in some cases, take away from some of the evidence of a nuclear taboo in the taboo literature. It also makes a case that indirect and external pressures can make normative pressures can affect U.S. policymakers' decision-making, or at least their perceptions of them. But I think this is more than an academic distinction. If the argument is that external sort of public opinion might constrain what U.S. policymakers are willing and not willing to do, and those sources of public pressure erode or change over time, that might also change the constraints that U.S. policymakers perceive themselves to be facing. And this kind of reputation might work together with other explanations for nuclear non-use, but I don't think they're one and the same. Okay, so in general, and we all, I think, probably know this literature pretty well, at some level, all these explanations that we typically turn to, these big theory explanations, leave us needing to understand what policymakers' internal motivations and beliefs and intentions are, and they all make some reference to reputation as a part of that story. But empirically, we might never know what they really believe. If you read these policymakers' diaries, they go back and forth, they talk about things and they talk about other things, and they're not really consistent about it. But conceptually, I think we can make progress in dealing with the mechanisms behind them. Okay, so we know that deterrence sort of focuses on sort of worries about the extreme material costs of nuclear use. Tradition and taboo, however, think about it a little bit differently. They think more about the political costs in some ways. The traditional literature thinks about prudence, setting precedents for the future. So if I use nuclear weapons now, that means I've sort of lowered the threshold. Somebody might use them against me later, and so there are material costs that I need to be worried about, but they're in the future. They're not necessarily in the present. And there are political costs that might come along with it. The taboo literature looks at this sort of intersubjective normative prohibition that has developed over time that stigmatizes the bomb. And they all use reputation, but in different ways. And the reputation literature and deterrence is obviously very well developed. It's thinking about past action as an indicator of future credibility. Will you actually strike me if I strike you? So you're looking at sort of reputation as this idea of past action and what does that indicate and provide information for future action. But tradition and taboo think about it differently. And they think about it differently in ways that I don't think are particularly well developed theoretically or empirically. The traditional literature talks a lot about global public opinion pressures without sort of defining what that means. And the taboo literature, too, thinks about pressures from domestic and global public opinion. And so the tradition and taboo literatures are sort of talking about reputation potentially in similar ways, but not necessarily developing it very well. And so I think there's more work to be done on reputation, and it's linked to public opinion in those literatures. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what is the nuclear taboo. If I'm going to tell you why these reputational concerns might ultimately be something a little bit different than the nuclear taboo, I think I want to be clear about that, what that is, and that's sort of a messy concept itself. So at a basic level, a nuclear taboo is a widespread, informal, prohibitionary norm against, and then often bracketed as the first use of nuclear weapons, right? This basically just says we have an informal norm. It's not codified into international law. That doesn't make it any different than what the traditional literature says. They're both saying it's an informal prohibitionary norm. But taboo scholars say, look, taboos are stronger than a regular norm. And what makes a taboo stronger for Tannenwald and other scholars is that it takes on these additional characteristics. That a taboo is absolute, it's unthinking, and it's taken for granted. And it has these qualities that are sort of attached to it. All three of these qualities, however, have been called into question sort of time and again in the empirical literature. If it's absolute, why are we talking about first use only, and under what conditions are we talking about first use? If it's unthinking, why are we talking about military planning and seeing this kind of come up as a consideration in some discussions? Is it really taken for granted? As some of the empirical research by Sagan and Valentino suggest, perhaps it is actually called into question and less strong than we think it is. So this suggests that even if there is a norm, an expectation of no first use, it may not sort of meet these taboo criteria as the taboo literature has set them out to be. So we can talk about more broadly, what is a taboo outside of the taboo literature, but I think it's useful to sort of take it on its own terms. And in particular, I think that the consequentialist behavior that's attached to debates about nuclear use and sort of what cost it would have on public opinion is somewhat incompatible with that unthinkingness that's supposed to come with the nuclear taboo. And so thinking about the costs and benefits of nuclear use and thinking about the role of public opinion in doing that kind of goes against this unthinking quality. So in fact, I will argue that the Cold War nuclear taboo cases tend to rest on evidence about concern for worldwide public opinion, elite reactions, public opinion reactions from foreign countries, but that doesn't sit well with the taboo arguments as a result. So why is reputation something a little bit different than the nuclear taboo? Let me say a little bit more about this. And I want to return to the idea about what we mean by reputation when we talk about reputation. When we talk about reputation with the deterrence literature, something very specialized for political science and IR scholars, we don't talk about reputation in the way that the regular normal people do, right? We talk about it as meaning this sort of idea about past action reflecting on being information for future use. But when we talk about reputation in the real world outside of IR, we talk about it more in this way. That reputation is a common estimate of an actor's character, the esteem in which they're held, how we view them, right? How we collectively view somebody. And that's a very different understanding of reputation than the deterrence literature. So I'm arguing that this is sort of a separate way of thinking about it. This means that reputation here is a collective judgment of a community on somebody else. You can't, as a member of that community, make your own reputation. You can try to shape it, but it's actually something that's held by others, right? And so I'm going to pick on Randy a little bit here. I had never met Randy before I did security studies, but he comes with a reputation, right? Do you have, Randy, what would you assume, what would you think of your reputation to be? That's a nice word. Bombastic. So you have these, people have these ideas of you sort of collectively. Last year, somebody was like, oh, I went to a panel and Randy was really nice and I didn't really understand what that was all about. And so, right, it's not something that you can control yourself, but what you do might shape how others think about you, right? And so actors can seek to shape their reputations, they can engage in image management, but they can't actually dictate necessarily how everybody will then think about them. But this gives us a sense of why states might care about world opinion, right? It's sort of what others think about them, and it reflects back on them and kind of how they think about themselves and their own identities. And so understood in this way, I think there's a link between sort of reputational concerns and international norms. That international norms and saying what appropriate behavior is set some kind of standard for how we assess an actor's reputation. What do we do? How should we behave? And does that actor actually do that? Right, so there's a strategic link potentially then between compliance, reputation, and international norms. That in complying with international norms, we might do that as a part of our strategic image management. We might not just do it because we believe in the norm. There are other reasons we might do it too. It doesn't mean we don't believe in the norm. It just means that there are strategic reasons that we might comply in order to sort of affect our reputation overall. And I think that there are certain norms that do this better than other norms. And so norms that are clear-cut, where you know if they're being, it's clear if they're being complied with or not. It's clear if you use a nuclear weapon in a war, might be a pretty clear-cut thing. There's often talked about a fire break between conventional and nuclear use during war. Behavior that's publicly viewable, that you can't sort of hide. So often we talk about breaking taboos in kind of regular social life. You do that in private. You don't do that in public, and that you can break it without paying those sort of reputational consequences. That's a lot harder to do when you're talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons use in war, and that behavior is attributable to the actor that did it. It's clear that who actually engaged in that behavior. I think nuclear weapons can do this fairly well also. But this need not apply to nuclear weapons when we're talking about reputation. It may extend beyond nuclear norms and nuclear behavior to affecting other norms and other reputations as well. So as I'll show in the case studies, there's also an interest in the United States in thinking and trying to portray itself to the world as a non-racist world power. Right? If it drops the bomb on Asia, again, it will be seen as racist. It's less about the bomb than it is about sort of norms about racial equality. So as a result, I think this becomes related to, but separate from taboo talk. And so if taboo talk is about sort of morals and norms, talking about public opinion and what does the world view us and how does the world see us is something that's different. That reputation talk, to the extent that we see it in the cases, might be different than taboo talk, right? And so we shouldn't conflate one for the other. And in the cases, I'll show how reputation talk might work together with perceptions of military utility or lack thereof as a part of that sort of cost-benefit calculus by U.S. policymakers and be a part of that broader strategic decision-making. Okay. As I said, I can't promise any fancy survey experiments about public opinion. I look at cases of U.S. cases of Cold War, serious consideration of nuclear weapons use during different administrations. I kind of try to catalog in the paper a number of public threats and sort of private discussions, but I want to focus not on the public stuff so much as the private stuff and kind of avoid those threats for show kinds of cases that might have something to say about reputational concerns in different ways. I focus on the U.S. here. I think it's possible that you could extend the argument to Russia, but I don't speak Russian, and I think somebody who speaks Russian would be better equipped to do that, to see if those kinds of propaganda, especially considerations, come up with the Soviet Union. I think from what little I've read about China in this case, it seems like China potentially does think about sort of how would the world view Chinese nuclear weapons use, with the sort of conclusion, at least by Mao, that it didn't seem like it would be a problem. But this is sort of where I focused, is on the U.S. I try to focus on internal meetings and memoranda so we can sort of see what's happening behind the scenes. Here I would expect to see reputation talk, discussions about public image, discussions about public opinion, and also potentially efforts to assess what that international public opinion might be, so that they go out and search for information on U.S. image abroad. What I'm not doing is trying to assess and make any claims about true moral principles and normative commitments by U.S. policymakers. I don't think I can make those claims, and so please don't take this as some kind of assertion that they don't care about those things. So I focus on the Korean War and Vietnam War at this point, in part because they're really key cases for the taboo literature. They're historically important cases on their own. They give us different administrations at different points in time, so we could see potentially how a norm or taboo might take hold after 10 years or something. I thought about doing post-Cold War cases. I think it makes sense to keep this one relatively constrained, but we can talk about how you might view that. Whether that might be worth an addition or other Cold War cases. These are the first drafts of the case studies. I've gotten a chance to go to the National Archives a couple of times, but I've only done sort of the initial draft. Okay, so during the Korean War, the U.S. military thinks about possible uses for the atomic bomb over time, sort of persistently, but also faces what it sees are sort of persistent target selection problems. If you're going to talk about how troops are moving in sort of small groups, it's really much harder to sort of figure out how you can use nuclear weapons usefully here. So they see it as sort of there's potential military use for it. We might bomb infrastructure, but we're not sure that we can do it very usefully. We have a small arsenal, so we're not just going to kind of throw these bombs around. But at the same time, they're also expressing pretty strong and persistent concerns for global reactions, and that kind of concern, I think, tips the scale against seeing nuclear weapons as sort of useful here. They think that there are sort of high political costs based on political reactions elsewhere. They're not making these claims about the U.S. domestic public. In some cases, they're saying, we think the U.S. domestic public might actually call for nuclear weapons use. We're considering more of the international public, international elites, and the global public. And in particular, you hear policymakers expressing concern for the appearance of the U.S. as a racist power if it dropped the bomb on Asia for a second time, an Asian state, and an irresponsible or aggressive nuclear power, and that potentially it would violate no first use norms. So you see a lot of these kinds of arguments that are coming up, and it seems particularly concerned with how U.S. allies in Asia would respond to the use of the bomb, and that this would cause problems for U.S. basing and U.S. alliances in general. And often we hear it, in particular, kind of put in the context of the propaganda war with the Soviet Union, which I found really interesting and wasn't something I expected to see. They sort of constantly or fairly regularly refer to how this would play out in Soviet propaganda, how this would make the U.S. look, and that it would sort of weaken the U.S. alliance position abroad. And that the Soviets would then look like the responsible, peaceful power, and the U.S. would look like the irresponsible, aggressive power. So they're thinking about sort of a wide range of reasons for why we wouldn't, public opinion reasons for not using the bomb. And they sort of do, in their analysis, they sort of say, yeah, we'll do it. It's worth the cost. It's worth the public opinion cost, only in the event of a general war with the Soviet Union. It has to be a really big deal for us to use up the arsenal and suffer the public opinion costs of doing this. So you see the sort of conversations about military utility intersecting with conversations about worries about public opinion. So they're prepared to use it, and they're prepared to pay those reputational costs, but only under the right conditions. And in fact, they suggest that there might be conditions where it is seen as socially acceptable, that if they get support from the United Nations first, they get UN support, then it will be seen as okay, and the public will understand, and that if they manage to do it without a lot of civilian damage or any civilian damage, then the public would also be okay with it. So they seem to think that nuclear weapons at this point are usable, but they would have to do them in the right circumstances or pay high costs for doing it. In this period, we see also both the State Department and the U.S. military making efforts to track and analyze global public opinion. So they go out and they run studies in parts of Asia and Western Europe to try to assess potential reactions from elites, sometimes, and from the general public sometimes. They're not always clear what they mean by global public opinion. That's sometimes what they just say. They're focused in particular on Asia and Japan, but they also are interested in sort of what the Europeans would think. So they run these studies. Over time, it seems like they reference some of these studies in their discussion. So there's this worry that they'll pay high political costs. They'll appear racist, they'll appear aggressive, that they'll have problems with their alliances, in particular that using the bomb would create. And that can be sometimes with elites and foreign leaders. They'll try to assess, this is what we think the Prime Minister of India will say. This is what we think that the Prime Minister of Great Britain will say. And sometimes they think it's more of a general public, and they don't really articulate clearly who they're thinking about. But they're still thinking about these external actors making judgments on how they view the U.S. During the Vietnam War, we see similar concerns. Militarily, it's also difficult to find kind of good targets. The target selection problem is still there. It's also a war that's deliberately fought within limits, even before you start talking about nuclear weapons. So it's not surprising that we're not talking about nuclear weapons as easily here. But they still planned nuclear weapons use to avert military disaster, and they still seem to think that it's sensible. So putting nuclear weapons on the table in sort of conversations inside the U.S. and with the South Vietnamese allies was seen as a sensible thing. They didn't necessarily know what they thought the answer was. Yes, you should do it. No, you shouldn't. But it was seen as a reasonable point of conversation. And so they sort of put them on the table. In particular, the plan was to use nuclear weapons if you were to need to avoid another Dien Bien Phu, looking at sort of the French experience and saying, well, we don't want that to happen to us. A few nuclear weapons, they say, would have cleared that problem up. And so if we find ourselves in that position again, then we need to sort of avoid it, to have sort of this demoralizing takeover of the communists, essentially. And there's a debate about whether Quezon in 1968 fits those criteria, and it sort of leaks over into the public press, and there's a lot of concern in Washington and elsewhere that the U.S. is considering using nuclear weapons in 1968. Doesn't go well. The U.S. insisted it's not trying to do it, but they do sort of behind the scenes inquire if there are nuclear weapons in the area and whether they might use them. Throughout all of this, there are big concerns for the U.S. attached to the nuclear use potentially and otherwise, that the U.S. was losing sort of the image war with the North Vietnamese, that even if it didn't use nuclear weapons, it was already looking pretty bad in the public eyes, and that doing so, using nuclear weapons, once again would appear racist and aggressive. Okay, so it's not just about sort of nuclear use. They're concerned about the broader U.S. image in the war, worry that it's not going very well, and that once again they're sort of losing the propaganda contest, and that using nuclear weapons would make it worse. They're very careful to sort of shape what the public image looks like. So they want to prevent leaks. They don't want it to get out that they're thinking about using nuclear weapons in a couple of cases. They want to avoid public mention of nuclear consideration. They don't really want to sort of raise those concerns and get sort of that pushback. So they're very careful about the image they're trying to present to the public. There's an exchange between Rusk and Fulbright around in 1968 about having public hearings, and sort of Fulbright says we should, the U.S. public should know we should have these public hearings and air these concerns. And Rusk said this would be inappropriate and irresponsible, and we're not doing that, and we're absolutely not considering nuclear weapons. And that's not really clear that that's the case. Even efforts under Nixon to signal to the Soviets that we're willing to use nuclear weapons, they try to do that sort of outside of the public eye. So on the one hand, maintain this sort of public image of not considering to use nuclear weapons, even as Nixon's trying to engage in sort of his madman diplomacy behind the scenes. They didn't want to sort of create that negative public reaction. So once again, they're very careful about sort of shaping their public image. Unfortunately, with the Vietnam War, there's less sort of documentation that's still available. There are lots of nice sounding boxes at the National Archives that say McNamara and nuclear on them, and they're still classified. So I want to end with a couple of big picture conclusions, and then we can take lots of questions. One is that I want to sort of hope that I can persuade you that reputational concerns, these sort of consequentialist calculations about sort of public opinion costs about nuclear weapons use, are separate from taboo explanations that are looking more specifically at moral and normative considerations, and that they might be related to one another. Those reputational concerns can be reactions to perceptions of norms held by others, but they don't necessarily indicate that U.S. policymakers hold those norms themselves. And that we can see U.S. policymakers doing this deliberately. They're seeking out information about public opinion, about sort of what the U.S. views of the U.S. would be. They're expressing concern for the reputational consequences of their decision-making, and they're particularly thinking about this in the context of a propaganda war with the Soviet Union. So they're thinking very sort of deliberately about this. And here, rather than thinking about these as different explanations, I would argue that they're related to each other. They interact with one another. These military strategic calculations and concerns interact with these normative strategic concerns. Finally, I think this maybe raises some interesting questions for contemporary debates. There's a lot of literature kind of reassessing where we're at with nuclear weapons today. For those who are interested in sort of the potential for nuclear weapons to have lower levels of damage and better targeting over time, does this mean that, as Lieber and Press would argue, that there's less concern for sort of human damage in using nuclear weapons, and that would make the public see them as more usable? And work by Sagan and Valentino especially suggests that domestic opinion in the U.S. against, or domestic taboo is weakening, and if that kind of public restraint weakens in general, that might make U.S. policymakers feel a little freer, a little less constrained in using nuclear weapons. On the other hand, we have discussions like the 2017 nuclear ban treaty that suggest there might be a widening gap between what the international public thinks and what the U.S. public thinks. If Sagan and Valentino have it right, and it's hard to know if they really do, if they have it right, and the U.S. is sort of more favorable to using nuclear weapons, it might be that the international public is not. So where does that sort of leave us? And I think that raises some interesting questions, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.